we will deal with genocides, we will deal with the most horrible human rights, but don't you have more everyday human rights violations that occur to people all over the world, for example, women or people with disabilities. So it did sound a little bit like a cop-out to me at first.
But Johannes, don't you think that it's really just the Secretary General trying to make sure that expectations are managed, that people don't expect too much? Exactly.
Yeah, that's very much what I, after further consideration, what I thought he probably meant. As you said, Mr. Hammarskjöld was a very pragmatic man, and probably he already foresaw the problem, what we're talking about now, 75 years after the foundation of the United Nations, that people become frustrated. They say, okay, we have the United Nations. They have this big goal of securing peace and of securing human rights. Why are we still seeing all these terrible incidents happening all over the world, in Libya, in Syria, and in our everyday lives? And I thought that maybe instead of him wanting to cop out, or him letting the UN cop out, he wanted to make sure that we and national states don't cop out, that we don't expect, say, now have the rather wanted to say, we will do this, but you also have to play your part. It's not the United Nations that can achieve human rights realization single-handedly, but instead every state, every civil organization, every individual has to play his or her part.
Thanks, Johannes. Just to develop something that you've said, this concept of heaven, you know, and this concept of hell, you know, is hell gross violations of human rights? Do you think that's what's meant? Earlier, you know, you said to me something about an individual violation of a human right amounts to hell.
Yes, I think, yeah, that is a very good point. I think if we look at human rights law, the focus is the individual. And it has been stated many times that human rights are indivisible and universal. So it is appropriate, in my opinion, for human rights, a human rights perspective, to look at the life and the experiences of every individual. And then it doesn't make a big difference if you have a million people suffering, let's say in a war, or you have one person having their dignity and human rights violated. So from a human rights perspective, I would say hell is not only if you have genocide, these big newsworthy, like what you would see on the news, but hell is already if one single person has suffering from human rights violations. And so maybe if we apply this thought, this idea of human rights as universal, indivisible to Mr. Hammarskjöld's quote, it would mean, okay, he's actually not lowering the aspiration, he's not lowering the bar, but he's saying we have to prevent our goal, our work is only done when we when we achieve human rights for all, as it says in the preamble of the United Nations Charter.
Okay, thank you, Johannes. Just picking up on that point about individual violations, Leonora, you said to me in an earlier chat that we had that, you know, you felt that heaven was attained in certain parts of the world, that it really does depend on one's context and where one.
Yeah. Little doubt the UN made positive strides to achieve its mandate in several countries, but that there remain huge gaps in how the UN human rights framework is implemented around the world, and specifically in countries who maybe sign and ratify treaties more as an attempt to provide a veneer of legitimacy, but who actually have little interest in abiding by those obligations and little interest in doing what the treaty bodies and engaging with them, and that this is kind of where there is a key weakness in the UN human rights treaty body system, because while they're set up for dialogue, they often lack the power to effectively protect rights where states in some way oppose them, but where states maybe more passively reject or passively accept, in those instances the UN can play a role to change their position in a positive direction by reaffirming the goals and the standards that are set up for in the human rights conventions and treaties.
Thanks, Leonora. So in your view, do you think the UN has met the low bar?
Country and context specific, and these country and context change from day to day, election to election. We see the US, we see Poland, Russia, where in a very short amount of time, how are been changed. Now in Syria, Xinjiang, Yemen, it is not.
Thanks, Leonora. Just picking up on this point about being context specific, and talking about the global South and issues facing the global South. You spoke earlier about, Leonora, about elections and about how obviously we've got elections on our mind right now. The whole world is looking and waiting to hear about the results of the US election. But moving away from just changes within national politics, but talking about issues.
Salona, I think your sound.
Okay, apologies for that. Thank you everyone for letting me know I was muted. Okay, all right. I'd like to draw Abel into the conversation now. Abel, speaking up on this issue about context specific. Leonora mentioned the fact that elections can have an impact on whether or not this low bar is met. And of course, we're thinking about the US elections. But give me your view about what you think is happening in the African context.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to speak here today. It's a great milestone in two fronts. Firstly, the UN is clocking 75 years this year, and then also, and secondly, and sadly, retirement of Professor Manjoo. Salona, to speak about whether or not the UN is meeting its low bar in as far as the global North-South divide is concerned, I'd like to chip in with respect to the operationalization of the Bretton Woods institutions. Obviously, we know that the pandemic has not spared most African countries and has made, the African economics or those of developing nations in a worse off position. But the challenge that is there is in respect to accessing aid from these Bretton Woods institutions, which has been a really difficult position for most developing or most African countries. Tied into that is the issue of China in the East, which seems to be providing bailout packages without any proper regulation and no proper checks. And when it comes to the issues of human rights, we know that China has very proper international economic law regulating developing nations can access aid either through the Bretton Woods institutions or from the East, being China. We see a trickle-down effect of human rights, poor human rights records in nations that are accessing aid from China. For example, Zambia currently has private and public debt to the tune of 12 billion United States dollars, and out of which 9.4 billion is owned by China. Now, the net effect of that is that China brings that money into most of these developing states on a BOT, that's a build and operate transfer mechanism, allowing China to come and control. It's a sort of give and take type of scenario. So China will give and will dictate terms under which that money is going to be used, usually appointing its own organizations or institutions to come and access that money through structural development, it'd be roads, infrastructure, and as the case may be. But what the effect of that for me is that when you are dealing with institutions with poor human rights records, and they are coming into developing nations such as Zambia, they are bringing with them that mindset of a lack of protection of human rights. So generally speaking, Salona, in the absence of proper regulation of how international aid can be accessed, it be from the Bretton Woods institutions or from the East, now China, which seems to be bailing out most economies, we see generally in developing nations poor human rights records, as the case may be. So for me, to answer you on the issue of whether or not the UN is really meeting its low bar as regards world economies, I think for me it has been lagging behind in terms of a lack of proper international regulates external most developing countries to bilateral relationships, and there's no proper regulation. So that for me is one of the failures. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, April. I just want to pick up on what you said about how there's a need for what I think you're hinting at is greater agreement between states, better multilateral agreements. So more working together. And the worrying thing that we're seeing is that we're seeing states closing in. We're seeing a closing up. If you look at the Paris Agreement, for instance, taking us away from just the financial Bretton Woods institutions that you've been talking about, but talking about how this multilateralism is needed for in order for us to achieve really the really important global threat that has a direct impact on human rights, and also when it comes to this global health crisis that we're in. And Lorna, you said to me that you're very concerned about. If I could just draw you into the conversation, you said to me that you're very concerned about the current global health crisis, the lack of genuine concerted effort amongst states to work together, and of course the huge economic repercussions affecting the marginalized. Do you want to just pick up on that?
Thank you, Salona. Yes, what we've seen across the world with the lockdowns in particular has been also a closing of economies and widespread unemployment. And we know already that women carry the burden of care in our society, caring for families and caring in communities. And as we've seen over the past decade, maybe 2 decades, increased feminization of labor through widespread globalization. The threat that women is quite significant at this time. To have to carry the burden of care, they have to do the reproductive work. And then, in fact, we know that community care workers around the world are about 90% made up of women. So the very crisis that we face and the essential workers whose praises we now all sing have in many countries been volunteers since about the late 90s, where community care workers became much more widespread due to the HIV/AIDS crisis. Well, even starting in the 80s, but many being volunteers and not being paid. And in our country, it's been a big battle to get community care workers recognized as bona fide health care workers and properly paid and duly employed by the state. And in fact, when the state started to do that, they reduced the numbers that they would employ, in spite of the fact that we had so much more doing the work and they were already burdened with the work. So we see that the burden that women have to carry in this period is quite significant. And we have to acknowledge that a lot of that is really on the shoulders of Black women and poor women. And what we saw in Cape Town and in various other poorer communities was women creating soup kitchens to feed their communities, without resources, the same women, so added burden. And then I just want to mention, Salona, that we also saw an increase in domestic violence in homes. Women were struggling with, in the city of Cape Town, families who had people who were addicted to substances and no places to go to for support because everything was closed and rehabs were closed. And I'm actually not even sure if they're able to function at this time, but I know under level 2, they were still not open. So people having withdrawal symptoms at home and families having no capacity to actually deal with that or to even understand what is happening. And then there's also the migrant refugees and asylum seekers who have really suffered because they are also at the intersection of migration and poverty. And then being in our country where the Department of Home Affairs has stated that nobody's permit is going to be renewed, but you will not be arrested. They say on their website, don't worry, we won't arrest you. I don't know what's the comfort in such a statement to tell somebody you won't be arrested, but you've got a document that literally says you should have left the country at this point, say in March, in April, in May. We are now in November, and they've extended that date, and the last time I looked, it was extended till the 31st of October. So we have so many people in our country, non-local people, who do not have the documents that give them safety in the society, where they are being threatened daily by narrow-minded, fascist-thinking people who are promoting xenophobia in our country. And the lack of those, being renewed has if the banks are not aware, then the staff chase people away. People have also lost their jobs, but accessing funds has become a problem. So there's quite a range of issues that, to my mind, basically says that the UN hasn't met this low bar that they've set for themselves.
Thank you, Lorna. I think you've made quite a strong case, and and you've summarized, I think, quite accurately the feeling on the ground, and how when we speak about the UN, we speak about these lofty ideals, but maybe it is coming back to what the Secretary General said, that it's not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. Are there different degrees of hell? I don't know, but Zaid, of course, I know. Thank you, Lorna. I'm just going to draw Zaid into the conversation. Zaid, you said, yesterday when we chatted that, or it was the day before, about the consequences and the impact of this U.S. election, and that how you were waiting to find out whether you could go back home or not, whether you want to go back home or not. Do you want to just, as a Palestinian American, do you want to maybe just talk about what, in your opinion, is the consequence or the impact on human rights that the results of this election will have?
Yeah, thank you, Salona, and everyone for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I think, first of all, I should apologize on behalf of the U.S. that we unfortunately have to be front and center of everyone's minds, especially as I'm currently refreshing election results in a different tab in the background. But yeah, I think in terms of the statement that the former Secretary General made, I think that it's quite difficult because I'm not sure if it's even if preventing hell as opposed to reaching paradise is lowering the bar so much as it is removing it completely, in terms of it's much more difficult to prove that something doesn't exist or something that has been, as opposed to something that speaking as somebody who's a diaspora Palestinian living in the US, I am quite cynical about the UN, because on the one side of part of my identity, it's been quite ineffectual in terms of ensuring the right of my family to return and having a substantive impact on the lives of so many. And then on the other side, as an American, having to deal with this U.S. exceptionalism, where the UN is maybe ineffective for different reasons, that it is unable to trump, no pun intended, these U.S. ideals of kind of isolationism. So yeah, and then in terms of the actual impact of the elections, I can't say for sure. I don't want to make any predictive statements in case they aren't true. But I think that anything is on the table. Probably far more is on the table than people may have thought over the past 4 to 5 years. So I think that's, yeah.
Thanks, Zaid. I appreciate your comments. Are we being, coming back to the statement, are we not being too pessimistic? Are we throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Lorna, Zaid, as well as Abel have outlined, I think, the key issues with the UN, although we haven't yet discussed issues with the Security Council. But is there, are we being too pessimistic? Rebecca, you expressed a certain amount of optimism about the UN and the fact that you believe there's still a lot of good. The UN is doing a lot of good, and that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, do you want to just comment on that? Rebecca. All right. Would somebody else like to jump in on that? I think we've just lost Rebecca.
Salona, Abel here. Yeah, I could jump in. I mean, yeah, not to entirely sound pessimistic and criticize the achievements of the UN. I mean, I did mention before that there have been positive strides that have been made. For example, during its 75-year period in existence, the UN has been deliberate in terms of say, for example, protection of women's rights. We saw the coming into effect of the CEDAW, which is an instrument deliberately designed to protect the rights of women. We've seen the devising of the CRC, which again is a deliberate move by the UN to protect the rights of children around the world, and several others. I mean, the operational mechanisms of the UN may not be effective as we would like, but there have been positive strides in terms of is sort of put into effect. So not entirely. I mean, we are trying to identify some of its gaps, on its 75-year-long journey, but not to say the UN has entirely failed. It has, for me, made a lot of positive strides and has helped achieve its mandate through devising of international instruments, for example, such as the ones I've spoken about, as with intent and deliberately to do so.
Thank you. Thanks, Abel. I see that Rebecca is online, and she has said she's able to get her mic to work. Rebecca? Rebecca, we can't hear you. All right, Rebecca, we'll get back to you. Let's talk a bit about the UN leadership, and I'd like to draw Didem and Christina into the conversation now. When we speak about the UN leadership, there's much talk about the composition of the UN Security Council, but of you, what do you see as a major issue with the leadership of the United Nations?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for letting me participate in this. I do so with great pleasure. Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. And just as what you said earlier, Salona, with are we all being too pessimistic? And I think, yes, a little bit, definitely. But I also think that it's quite important with that kind of statement, going back to the statement, that one is critical of it because it is such a big institution, and it is politics also in the end, and defining our lives to a certain degree. And my main issue is, and that's also what I was chatting to you about, and with this statement, that I think when you say hell, which if you used it synonymously for, say, war, and then drawing back to the UN's first mandate and its actual mandate being their peacekeeping mandate, then I do think that not even that is achieved, as I think Lorna was saying earlier, depending on the context and the country. But looking back at our conflicts, at international conflicts or interstate conflicts the last 20 years, it's most of the time, one of the main reasons was obviously the blocked Security Council. So yeah, going back to your first question, is as to what I think of the UN leadership. Not a lot at the moment.
Thanks, Didim. Christina, do you want to chip in on that point?
Yes. Hello. Thank you, Salona, and thanks for the opportunity to join this discussion. There's a few points that come to mind thinking about this theme of UN leadership. And I think the first one I want to sort of echo some of the other speakers is to say that reflecting on 75 years of progress, there's no doubt that the UN's leadership in human rights is significant. And I think that, recognizing that undeniable advances have been made in human rights protection on paper and in reality, certainly since we started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All of the international human rights treaties exist because of the UN sort of platform and space to create them. And so there's been quite a lot of gains in terms of standard setting, building consensus on key human rights issues, and around state obligations for protections. And I do think that this framework does play out in the work that the UN does, not just the high-level political work in Geneva or New York, but around the world at different levels and supporting different actors in countries. So with that said, I also think that, as we know, the situation of human rights currently is not heaven. There is a fight for human rights around the world that continues in many places and in many contexts. And it's often this struggle, as other speakers have mentioned, about closing this huge gap that can exist between these protections we have on paper and lived realities. And I think, certainly Rashida's work has shown us as well the extent to which this is evident with violence against women, which still is pervasive. Downside of which is, the UN is the sum of its state parties. The reality is that states tend to act in their own interests, and this can often hamstring the UN's ability to take action on human rights issues, especially in crisis situations. Of course, we've seen the UN fail to save people from hell, this most basic low standard for example, the genocide in Rwanda. More recently, human rights violations perpetrated against the Rohingya people in Myanmar. So we obviously have a big gap here between this aspirational protection of human rights and the realities. And I think, as you mentioned, the Security Council has a role to play here. I mean, this is the heart of political leadership, but we've seen the Security Council unable to effectively confront some major emerging human rights threats right now. I mean, the current COVID-19 pandemic brings with it huge human rights challenges, but we've seen very little action from the Security Council, and we can look to sort of the membership of the Council to understand why, but this is a real challenge. And at the same time, we see rising authoritarianism, xenophobia in politics around the world, including, as you said, in Europe. We've all seen some of this playing out in a dramatic way with the US elections. And there's also been a pushback on human rights globally as part of these political movements, so especially with threats to women's rights. So I think that, given the current political climate, UN leadership on human rights is crucial, but we can also see that in reality, there's a lot of challenges to this, including because of the actions of various states.
Thank you, Christina. I know that Rebecca is trying really hard to get back into the conversation. Rebecca, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Salona. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for indulging me, and I apologize to everyone for any inconvenience caused, but it's such a treat to be able to speak and engage with everyone in honor of Professor Manjoo. And I think it actually worked out well to speak after Christina, as I think she touched on a few points that I wanted to echo. And notwithstanding all the issues we face on the ground, tangibly, certain things that about and about. But I think, if anything, the Trump administration has showed us how important it is to hold on to these norms and these values that the UN Charter in particular and the whole international community championed during the start of the UN. And I think even though, and I accept that on the ground, gender-based violence remains rife, all these other issues remain pertinent and unfortunately we're not seeing the realization of human rights. But I do still think that the UN plays a role in having a norm-changing impact. And before this meeting in preparation, I was just going through the UN Charter and just looking at Article 1 and this idea of collective measures, friendly relations, international cooperation. At the UN, but I still think that it's a fight and it's an institution worth fighting for and trying to be part of that change. And from a South African perspective, and especially a legal one, I do still think that we can take a step back and both look at those international norms and how they trickle down domestically and impact our law in South Africa. So, for instance, I was looking through some of Professor Manjoo's reports when she was a special rapporteur, and for me, what was really interesting is the amount of important research that is generated through the UN. Even though we may not see certain resolutions being passed and on the ground an impact, the amount of data that's collected, the amount of cooperation with organizations is actually helping us better understand the picture on the ground before we can even resolve it properly. So for me, going through those reports was quite humbling to say, well, yes, on the ground, gender-based violence is still rife, but at least we can understand the intricate issues at play, or better understand, rather. And one last point for me, which was quite interesting, and from a legal perspective, is looking at, in a country like South Africa, where international law is binding, our constitution permits us to turn to international law. And even though certain decisions and through the optional protocol may not be hard law and enforceable, from a South African perspective, we still look up to it. So I was looking through Carmichael, a very well-known South African judgment. And for me, what was quite special was seeing recommendation 19 through CEDAW, that I know Rashida teaches her students so rigorously, and seeing that cited in a constitutional court judgment. So for me, even though that's not necessarily hard law being enforced at an international level, it's still having an impact on how domestic states can understand and interpret their laws, of course, notwithstanding the issues on the ground. So for me, I'm feeling there's so much work to be done, but let's rather reform the UN, be part of that change, as opposed to destroying an institution, or rather think we don't need such an institution. So thank you so much, Salona. I hope that I didn't speak too quickly, and I'm glad everyone could hear me.
Rebecca, because I'm an optimist, and it's always nice to end on a level of optimism. But I'm going to, just as final comments now, just rounding up this conversation, I'm going to ask the teacher of all teachers, Rashida, whether she'd like to give in her input on this conversation before I conclude the session. Sorry, Rashida, for putting you on the spot.
Well, I knew you would. Thank you so much to all our speakers, and thank you to Salona, Pia, and Renee for putting this together, and thank you to my colleagues for being here. This is what energizes me, is to plant seeds and then to hear how people take information into different directions, the arguments, etc. So it's been wonderful to hear the different perspectives from students, and I wish we could do more of these kind of events because there are just so many issues. So I think, the heaven and hell issue, for me, it's important. Martha Minow, who was the dean at Harvard Law School, still teaches there, once said, where you stand is what you see. And that is so important, the context, right? The issue around the multilateral agreements, the structural adjustment programs, the noose that gets put around the necks of countries through borrowing from the IMF, the World Bank, etc. feminization of poverty, which we know has always existed, whether it's through work policies, it's through in family relationships, through violence, etc. But COVID has highlighted, as Lorna noted, the burden of care, reproductive work, etc. The US elections, of course, between the Zondo Commission and Trump, I'm going crazy. Should I say I use what's Didi Miani's not answering any questions and invoke a right to not to self-incriminate. But the US elections have an impact globally. We see that in the global gag rule on reproductive rights and who gets funded and the policies on abortions, etc. We see it in the issue of statelessness, immigration, refugee protection, etc. We see it in the exceptionalism where the US came up with its own, the Pompeo Commission on Inalienable Rights. And it's kind of wanting to redefine human rights. So let's ignore the 75 years, let's ignore the standard setting, the treaties, etc. Let's come up with our own and then impose it on the world. And the pushback from the UN is problematic in many ways, and it is the piper calling the tune, and we see that with the COVID and the World Health Organization issues. We see it with UNFPA, the funding that was cut a few years ago by the US. Some of the European governments come to the table to kind of address the gap. But the piper does call the tune in how the UN can be effective or can become completely dysfunctional. And there was a very nice quote by the Secretary General discussing the Security Council. And, you know, as academics, as activists, we keep on going on about Security Council reform, the permanent 5 membership and the problems with that. And in as much as I'm not a great fan of the Secretary General, but he said something in relation to the China, US, Russia stuff that's going on. And he said, you know, unfortunately, where there is power, there is no leadership. And where there is leadership, there is a lack of power. And I think it's so relevant, not only to the UN Security Council, but to our institutions as well. I mean, I'm thinking of UCT and the challenges that are coming up. And I think there is power, but is there leadership? And where there's leadership, the lack of power then stymies any kind of development. And COVID has done something else, which unfortunate, when we look at the death rates, etc., the challenges and the discussions that are going on, there's more human rights language being used, whether we talk about socioeconomic rights in terms of shelter, food security, etc., whether it's about access to medicine, and the discussions that are going on about how the global south might not benefit from developments and what do we do. So there's an activism around that, the debates in South Africa around land redistribution. I'm not a fan of the amnesty for corruption arguments, but the issue of corruption and human rights. People are using the human rights language during this time, and that's been, you know, a very positive sign for me, because that has always worried me. We educate our students, we send them out in the world, and then our South African students, how much of the human rights language do they use in their day-to-day work if our institutions are not using, not favoring international law, international human rights law. And so the one sort of sadness for me as I leave this place is that we were never able to get a Human Rights Institute going in the law faculty, because I think this bridging that theory-practice gap and institute helps to give our students a place to practice the theories that they learn, to do field work and, you know, skills around field work, etc. The other thing that COVID has highlighted is structural systemic problems around inequalities, discrimination, etc. And again, the Secretary General said something. The world is at a breaking point. This pandemic has been likened to an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. It is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all. The fiction that unpaid care work is not work. The delusion that we live in a post-racist world. The myth that we are all in the same boat, because while we are all floating on the same sea, it is clear that some are in super yachts, while others are clinging to the floating debris. And that, you know, highlights how COVID has refocused many of us, whether we use the language of human rights or social justice, inequality, discrimination. And for me, you know, I was counting back, and I actually have been working for 47 years and not 45. But I started at UCT in 1999. And I stress, as my students will note, equality, non-discrimination, state responsibility in all our discussions, whether we look at treaties, whether we look at country case studies. But for me, those principles are underpinned by two fundamentals, which is respect and dignity of all. And how do we ensure in all the work we do that respect and dignity of all are core fundamental values? Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, Rashida. And thank you to everyone for, to my 8 participants today for coming together and sharing your thoughts on these important issues. Just to conclude, I just want to abuse my spot.
Yes.
To just say a few words to
Hi.
Rashida.
Good, how are you?
Sorry, yes, thank you, mic's off. So just to say words, a very dear colleague and a mentor. We co-convene the human rights program at the LLM level together. Thank you for always challenging me, for always making me ask myself the difficult questions. Thank you for being the voice to the voiceless in the faculty, the voice for the voiceless in the faculty, as well as outside of the faculty in your work at the UN. Thank you for also being, I think, an important dissenting voice at times. And like all good dissents, you know, you force us to question our assumptions. And in the end, it often shows that your words were far more woke, as our students would say, and wise, and that we are much richer for it. So thank you for all that you've done and all that you continue to do. And on that note, I'll hand over to Pierre. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks, Salona, for the excellent way in which you moderated that. You have a budding career as a talk show host in front of you if you wanted to. Now that was the sort of issues part of the proceedings. Now we're going to have a few people saying a few words about Rashida. It is her retirement, of course, at the end of the year. So the first person who's going to say something is our surprise guest, Sibongile Ndashe, who's going to say something about Rashida's role in the struggle for women's rights. So Sibongile, the floor is yours. Sibongile, your microphone.
My mic.
Your mic is off again.
okay. All right, can you hear me now? Good.
Yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. A few days ago, Rashida sent me the invite to the farewell, but because I was a surprise guest and I didn't trust my mouth, I just didn't respond to it. So hi, Rashida. Happy to be here at your farewell. I hope you are surprised. Some time ago, I think when I started working, one of my supervisors said to me the difference between what is and what should be is what is our salaries. And I think that is what I believe Rashida's contribution has mainly been, the embodiment of the difference between what is and what should be. So it's my 5 minutes or 7 minutes as I've been given. And I'm going to try and do this by just mentioning a few examples of how I remember working, with Rashida, or just watching some of the contributions that she has made, to this work. I first met Rashida during the development of the Muslim Personal Law Bill. And one of the things was just really trying to find out who this coalition was, who were the women's rights group that were working then. I think at the time, she was with the Commission on Gender Equality. And one of the clauses that we had a problem with in this draft bill was, of course, there was a sensitive conversation around secularism. And so that one of the ways in which this bill could be sold to people who did not want to be bound by secular laws would be that there'll be an option to opt in or opt out. But the draft bill, what they did was to basically have a provision that says people will have to opt in, into the legislation. And I do remember that kind of conversation around us trying to push back and say that it's better for people to opt out, remove them. It's harder to be able to opt in. But I remember that solidarity and allyship, and I think that that's when our kind of working together actually started. But as being one of the things that could have actually made implementation of the law work or not work, the fact that this law has still not seen the light of day is not material. The second conversation, it's also still when Rashida's with the Commission on Gender Equality, and a case which doesn't often read like a women's rights case, but a very important development. And in this case, CGE was going to be an amicus, and they became an amicus to the Constitutional Court. And this is Bannatyne versus Bannatyne, where the Constitutional Court finally held that contempt of court proceedings to secure the enforcement of maintenance debt was an appropriate constitutional relief, for the enforcement of a claim. And the context, I think, around that time was about when it was shortly after the court had said no to civil imprisonment for debt. But here, I think the distinction, what was being drawn was about the difficulty in enforcement of maintenance orders and the distinction between people who can pay or people who won't pay. But I do remember that one of the valuable lessons was that sometimes you can go around knocking people's doors because people who were doing that work at the time, like women's rights work, they didn't see this as an important case. And I do remember that part of the pushing for that kind of argument and also saying that this was a viable constitutional case was a contribution that Rashida made. And then I think it's something that was just mentioned now about Rashida being a dissenting voice. And I think that's one of the things that she has also contributed to the decency of dissenting opinions. And one of the great examples is actually her work in the Equal Education Inquiry on Sexual Harassment. And basically the thing about being able to recognize gaps and then to be able to talk about it, because one of the things that she wrote in her dissenting opinion, it's really about how the terms of reference that set up the inquiry were flawed, and that that they focused on the vindication of the accused people and missed the objective which would have been of great assistance to the organization in terms of uncovering the extent of sexual harassment in the organization. And so it is also part of this idea that if the foundational work is flawed, then nothing good can come out of processes like that. And this is something similar than when she went to the United Nations as special rapporteur to say, okay, fine, my work is about elaborating norms and standards, but I want to be able to say that this is what I see as being missing, in this work. And so her work on recognizing the normative gap, about the lack of specific legal binding instrument to hold both state and non-state accountable, I think it's a contribution that even though the global treaty did not happen at that time, that this is something that we are still going to be able to see realized, because right now, I think the most recent edition of the Acta Juridica really talks about these kind of gaps in the African human rights systems. And now we are seeing a development of this treaty after the announcement by the current AU chair, Ramaphosa. And then finally, I think my last example of all of these things that Rashida embodies, it's this ability to kind of preempt fault lines. And then now that she has got all of these examples, we invited her very recently in the conversation around the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide in South Africa. And we wanted to really have a conversation about why the proposed mechanisms and the way in which they wanted to go about it was not fit for purpose. And she centered her contribution, on the importance of institutional memory, which she does have, and also the lessons on why previous machineries have not been able to work. And I end by one of the quotes, some of the things that she says on what we needed to look out for as we begin to build new mechanisms, obviously with the benefit of the history. So she acknowledges that even though there were things that we didn't take care of in the past, and some of the things look like they worked, when we are in this process of creating new things, we needed to be mindful of the fact that such initiatives took place in a different time with a different outlook on mechanisms and structures, views on partnerships. So all hands on deck to achieve the goal of emancipation of women. And despite concerns about conceptual and practical challenges, including implementation, enforcement, and oversights, and accountability issues. And so she reminds us that power does not readily acknowledge privilege and values of consensus in decision-making, and Ubuntu kind of precluded the harder discussions on individual, institutional, and structural oversight and accountability. So in one way, I am sad for UCT to be losing Rashida, but I am very looking forward to co-creating with her and working with her, to design and to actually ensure that all of the systems that we are trying to put in place, that there is at least some oversight over that, and that we will come, whether we are a dissenting voice or whether we are the voice that we are working on, but just to be able to say that we know what has not worked, but we also know what it would take to make things that work. So congratulations, Rashida, for a very successful, part. Like, I think that's one of the first parts of your career, as walk into the third, I think, act of your career. And I look forward to kind of, doing more work with you. Thank you.
Okay, so so thank you very much, Bongile, for that input. Some of our colleagues might not have gotten about the Commission for Gender Equality, so it's very pertinent that we are reminded of that again. We thought that it would be also appropriate for one of the members of the Department of Public Law to say something. So Jamila Umar is going to say a few words about Rashida and mentorship. So Jamila, it's over to you.
Thank you, Pierre, and everyone else. It's a great honor to participate today in this event for Rashida. I've been one of Rashida's mentees for a bit over 6 years now, so I can speak from real experience. As Sibongile has alluded to, and Salona as well, Rashida's role in the faculty has often been an oversight one, with a kind of long arm approach to taking stock and calling out injustices and inconsistencies when they happen. But that's not to say that she isn't also intimately involved with lots of different processes, such as sitting on the higher degrees committee, etc. So Rashida's influence has been felt, I think, across the faculty. For some who are thrust into a mentorship role, it's an accidental business, hopefully a happy accident, but sometimes not. But for Rashida, mentorship is a deliberate, purposeful, and motivational exercise. Rashida's mentorship extends to scholarship, making sure that new academics are finding the time to write, are not getting pushed into high teaching loads or high administrative loads. Her mentorship extends to advocacy. There are several events over the past few years or campaigns that I have had the privilege of being invited in. And that's because Rashida has openly said, please invite my colleague Jamila. She's really the one who should participate in this event. And she has absolutely no problem pushing other people forward and opening up space for those that she mentors, which is a really a testament to the kind of space opening kind of mentorship that Rashida always exercises. Her mentorship extends into teaching, both as a teacher herself, and I think we can all see that today with her students who have contributed so intellectually and intensively on the issues that she has engaged with them on. But she also models intensive and rigorous and compassionate teaching for those of us who are new to the profession. She's always challenging us to be more innovative in the classroom and to challenge our students and ourselves to take the academic enterprise forward. Her mentorship also extends to the personal. Rashida always takes an interest in what is happening in our lives outside of the academy. She's also willing to do all kinds of extra things, mentorship role, and furniture for their new office, and I know Fadil has benefited from that kind of mentorship. Rashida's mentorship also doesn't extend only to academic members of staff. She has been and is a mentor to support staff across the faculty and outside of it. And that's a really important thing to emphasize because it's quite rare in the academy. I think that many of us, and I'm going to just throw out some names. I'm sorry if I leave anyone out, but definitely myself. I think Salona, Nolundi, Fadil, we've all benefited from Rashida's mentorship directly. And in many ways, she has made our experience of UCT and the law faculty less lonely and less intimidating. And I think we don't talk enough about what an onerous role that can be for a senior, because we talk a lot about the isolation that Black members of staff feel in a place like UCT, and Rashida has mitigated that for many of us. But we don't talk enough about the loneliness and isolation that a senior Black woman of staff, and you know, notwithstanding those experiences that I'm sure Rashida has, you will never find her saying something like, well, I went through that, so you know, this is something that you just have to get through, and that is something that is really important, I think, to emphasize. Rashida is more likely to say, I experienced this, or other people that I know have experienced this. This is not going to happen on my watch. Rashida's mentorship is not of a formal hierarchical style, but one of compassion and friendship. Rashida is certainly my mentor, and many others here, but she's at the same time a friend. She's the best kind of colleague, mentor, friend that one can have. She will call you out if you are out of line, but she will equally call out other people on your behalf when they are out of line. Rashida, I have valued your mentorship, your friendship, your encouragement and support. I will miss your humor and the laughs we have shared over the years. I'm so sorry that this was the last year of your formal career at UCT, because I would have loved for all of us to have gotten to spend more time with you. But I know that this is not the end, and maybe because of this, Pia, we have to have another, and we definitely have to make firm plans to bring Rashida back to continue the mentorship, teaching, advocacy and scholarship that she has contributed to the faculty. So I'll leave it at that, and Rashida, you will be missed. So I hope you'll visit very often. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Yes, we've already discussed that as soon as we can, we should have an actual face-to-face event where we can really say goodbye in person. Not hopefully that it will be goodbye, because we hope that we will see Rashida around. The Dean of the Law Faculty, Dan Wood, it's now for you to say a few words on the retirement of Rashida Manjoo.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and Salona for organizing this event, and colleagues in public law, former students, and everyone attending this meeting, members of the faculty as well. It's a wonderful time to spend an afternoon celebrating the work of one of our most internationally known academic. I was introduced to Rashida somewhere around 2009 or early 2010 by Christina Murray, who was the former head of the Department of Public Law then. And she said, oh, this person is an exceptional human being, an accomplished gender activist, commissioner, and academic. If you could find something, she's just been appointed UN Special Rapporteur, could UCT do something to get her back into the faculty so she can do her work, but also contribute to teaching and learning. And so I did meet her, and we had a nice conversation, had chats with PJ, and found a way in which we could do that. And that's how Rashida joined the faculty. That was the second coming back for her, having been with the faculty, the department, before she went to the Commission for Gender and Equality. So at the beginning, she was teaching with us, but also doing the work of the UN Special Rapporteur. on violence against women. And so we were co-teaching. I was teaching international protection of human rights with her at the time. And the beauty of that was that that course deals with international institutions that make and enforce human rights. She was working with the system, which made it quite beneficial to me and to students in the arrangement and teaching of the course. Of course, after a few years, maybe 2-3 years, her passion for women's rights led her to introduce a separate course on women's rights, which meant that now we could teach international protection of human rights, women's rights, and children's rights, another course that I was doing. And between us and Wahida, we're teaching these separate courses which were complementing each other. So the human rights program grew with Rashida's coming, and she was bringing in the international experience and exposure to states and institutions of the UN to the classroom, which greatly, actually, if we can brag about this, the human rights law program in public law is one of the most subscribed courses, programs in human rights. I don't know whether we still have as the numbers as they used to be, but it was definitely for a long time the program that was attracting many students. So Rashida has been teaching this course for a long time now, almost the women's rights course probably 8 to 9 years. But in general, this program, because it has many students, it has also meant the demand for supervision has been high. So that's why maybe we see many of the participants here are former students of Rashida, whom she supervised as well, because the numbers were higher and students wanted to learn from her expertise on a one-to-one basis. Jamila has already talked about the contribution to mentorship and staff development that Rashida has dealt with. So I will not repeat that, but I want to emphasize the work that she has done for the UN as special rapporteur, because I don't think we recognize that well in this faculty. People don't actually know what that work meant and the impact that it had. So the UN Special Rapporteur, there are many, and one of the most important ones is on violence against women. It entails the person becomes a diplomat and champions the work, the implementation of human rights, dealing with, engages with states, engages with civil society and many other organizations, including universities. So it has promotional aspects of it and protective aspects. So where there are gross violations of human rights happening concerning women, that office deals with that. So it entails visiting and engaging with many states. It entails producing reports to the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council. It entails quite a lot of work. So during her tenure, she traveled to many countries and engaged with many states. And so she's very well known. That's why she's received a lot of honorary doctorates and awards. They're not handed out. One is UN rapporteurs who have never received those kinds of recognition. And it's because of her tenacity and belief in women's rights and her ability to engage diplomatically with states. Actually, those that know Rashida will notice that in the last 10 years, her diplomacy improved greatly. And that I think she also learned while doing this work, but also she used her skills to advance the work on violence against women. Within the UN circles, I'm a member of the UN Trust Fund on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, which means that I also engage with the UN Secretariat for the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And those are the people that support these treaty bodies, but also special procedures like special rapporteurs. And there you get stories about the successes and even gossip about everybody, the independent experts, including the special rapporteurs. Rashida has a huge reputation there, huge reputation, and people remember her up to now in those parts. For Africans, it's important to have people like that who did a lot of work, who exhibited exceptional qualities and abilities, because some people get appointed there from this continent. Of course, there are others from other continents as well, on political grounds. They are not really independent experts. They go there to earn trips to the UN or some allowances and things like that. So Rashida did not just do well in her portfolio, but she also raised the profile of Africans, African independent experts, that we can serve distinction just like people from other parts of the world. So congratulations, Rashida, on reaching the milestone retirement. I don't know how it feels to go into retirement, but I'm sure you will enjoy it. I know that you will be around and you'd like to continue to be involved. The emeritus position will be voted upon in Senate very soon. I'm happy to continue working with you, and congratulations once again.
Thank you, Danwood, for those words. We have come close to the end of the proceedings. Of course, it's a little bit formal now here on the internet, so it would have been much nicer if we could be all together and laugh and joke. But this event is to celebrate Rashida's career and to say goodbye, although it's still more than a month before retirement. Rashida, you have the floor now if you want to say a few words. Yes, if you are ready for that.
Hi, Pia, and everyone else. Thank you so much. I have a box of tissues here. It's been wonderful, the tributes, the affirmation, but most importantly, it's been a relationship with UCT that has been fraught in terms of appointments, etc. And, you know, as Jamila's noted, this is not a place that's responsive to difference in some ways. And as an older Black woman coming into the academic space, I mean, I was in the academic space in the 80s through the campus law clinic at the University of Natal. But there is something different at UCT, and I am grateful that I have had support from the leadership. So there's been 3 deans in my life: Hugh Corder when we were on Upper Campus, PJ and Danwood, people like Christina Murray, who was instrumental in bringing me here in 1999, and then, you know, having research associateship in the faculty. I've met the most amazing people in terms of our staff as well as our students, and it's been a wonderful journey. And when this event was discussed, and that was my first thing, my greatest joy is teaching. My greatest joy is planting seeds. And we can see the the next generation of human rights activists in coming from UCT on this continent. Recently, there was a discussion about an AU convention, a treaty on violence against women and girls. And, you know, it was so nice to send an email to the organizers and say, here's a student in Zambia, here's one in Nigeria, here's one in Kenya, and can you make sure that they're part of this discussion? So we had our UCT LLM graduates, PhD graduates participating. And I think that is something that is a strength, that we do attract students from all over the world who sometimes come here for the mountain and the scenery, but end up loving the country and, you know, the institution. And I'm very grateful for having had the opportunity, more or less over 20 years, of being part and parcel of UCT, of the law faculty in particular. And I am sure that you're still going to see my shadow in the corridors. I will continue to supervise students. I will continue to work with Salona when she introduces the course next year. I know she's more than capable, just having observed her skills today. She's more than capable of running that course without any assistance. But I'd like to be in the room because I love my interaction with students. So thank you very much to all of you. This is not goodbye with a finality. And I hope in both individually and collectively, we find spaces to meet and chat and continue these conversations. I think the kind of intellectual space that we would like to see, that we want to create, it is possible. And we have new young blood in the faculty, and we should draw on that, draw on the experiences. We got many of our young colleagues coming back with PhDs from different countries in the world. And how do we capitalize on that? How do we keep our conversations going? How do we deepen democracy, rule of law, due process, human rights, social justice in South Africa? Not just, you know, looking outside at the UN. How do we strengthen our African human rights systems? And, you know, the work that Sibongile does on the continent. We need to find opportunities to get our students involved in some of that work as well. So thank you to all of you. Thank you particularly Pierre, Salona, Rene for pulling this together. And thank you to the Dean, well, all three Deans, for your support over almost a 21-year period and for being supportive. We've had our challenges, but I am very grateful that I have been in this space and got to know many of you. So thank you.
Thank you, Rashida. You know, in this time of COVID, where we cannot go to the office, the sense of community feels lost. These events, I think, are rather important. So it's very fitting that we're having this event to celebrate Rashida and to say sort of a tentative goodbye for you, Rashida, because what so many of the speakers spoke about, you're caring about what happens, not keeping quiet when one shouldn't keep quiet, all of those things about community and about social solidarity. So I think it's really fitting that we had it today. And thank you. So I have to say a few thank yous. Firstly to Salona, mostly of all, who did a lot of the work to put this whole thing together. So Salona, thank you so much. Without you, it would not have been possible. I'm looking forward to the time when we can go back to the office and I can come into your office and we can have jokes about everything. To Renee, who also assisted with putting the invite together and so on. All of you who attended, because showing, of course, that there is some kind of sense of community and that you wanted to be here to say goodbye to Rashida, especially also to those who participated in the discussion. It was really wonderful to hear everybody speak. Some of you I know, some of you not, but it was really to use a member of the law faculty to see the quality of the students that came through the law faculty. That, I think that is everything. Rashida, it's not a final goodbye, because as I said, definitely next year or whenever the coronavirus permit, we're going to have a real get together where we're all in the same room without wearing a mask, hopefully. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice evening.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Pierre. Thanks, Salona.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Rashida. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Bye, Salona.
Bye, Salona. Thank you so much. Wonderful event. Bye-bye.